Timothy Ingold. However, before I introduce him, let me invite our director, Zhang Xun, to give a short opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Institute of Ethnology, I would like to thank Professor Tim Ingold for giving this year's Li Yih-yuan Memorial Lectures. Academician Li Yih-yuan was one of the founding fathers of the Institute in 1955. He was the second director, and he started the multi-interdisciplinary research in this institute. He published dozens of books on religious anthropology, medical anthropology, and public anthropology. Unfortunately, he passed away in the spring of 2017. The Institute of Ethnology set up this Li Yih-yuan Memorial Lecture in the winter of the same year to commemorate the achievement and the contribution Professor Li has made to this institute and to the anthropology in Taiwan. For the past 6 years, we have Professor Stephen Sandgreen, John Komarov, Garson Hage, Myron Cohen, Robert Weller, Philip Descola, and it is our honor to have Professor Timothy Ingold here for this year's lectureship. And after today's lecture, we have already had Professor Ingold's authorization to publish his speech in the Taiwan Journal of Anthropology for those who cannot come today. So I'd like to thank Sunde for receiving Professor Tim Ingold for the past few days, and he will go to Tainan tomorrow. And then after Taiwan, he will fly to Japan. So this is the trip for him in East Asia. So I wish you a good present day and present journey. Thank you.
I believe many of you know Professor Ingold and his works well. We have quite a few of his friends here. It's probably one of the reasons he promised to visit Taiwan. Professor Ingold is Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He had taught in University of Helsinki before moving to University of Manchester and was appointed Max Gluckman Professor of Social Anthropology in 1995. In 1999, he moved to Aberdeen, where he established the UK's newest Department of Anthropology. He retired from the university in 2018, but has continued to research and write as an independent scholar. Professor Ingold has carried out ethnographic fieldwork among Sami and Finnish people in Lapland. His interests are wide-ranging. They include environmental perception, language, technology and skill practice, art and architecture, creativity, theories of evolution and anthropology, human-animal relations, and ecological approaches in anthropology. His more recent research has pursued 3 lines of inquiry concerning the dynamics of pedestrian movement, the creativity of practice, and the linearity of writing. His most recent book, The Rise and Fall of Generation Now, contemplates life and the relations that sustain it. He focuses on the idea of generation and hopes for the possibilities of collaboration in order to respond to our contemporary questions. His lecture today, Manifesto for a New Humanism, is an issue closely related to his contemplation of human lives. It, as Professor said to me in his email, has been on his mind for a while, and he will present it to us today. Now let's welcome Professor Ingold.
Is that all right? Yeah. It's an enormous pleasure and privilege for me to be invited to present the Li Yih-yuan Memorial Lecture. This is my first visit to Taiwan, and I've received nothing but kindness and happiness while I've been here. I would very much like to thank the director of your institute, Professor Sun Chang, and Professor Shunda Yu for having me with you. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be among you here today. Some 300 years ago, philosophers in Europe instigated a program for universal human improvement that would come to be known as the Enlightenment. Their program rested on a newfound confidence in the faculty of reason, a faculty considered universal to human beings and to have been uniquely bestowed upon them by their creator. Empowered by reason, they thought, humankind had the potential to liberate itself from the constraints that bind all other earthly creatures within the confines of the natural world and to reach for the heights of civilization. They could become the masters of nature. Over the ensuing centuries, developments in education, governance, science, technology, and medicine, underwritten by this philosophy, would gather pace, spreading around the globe with trade and colonization. And they would go on to transform the lives of millions. The contribution of Enlightenment humanism to the common good is indeed undeniable. Human beings are living, on average, longer and in better health than ever before. More people than ever can read and write, enjoy the relative comforts of modern life, and widen their horizons through travel and tourism. And more are benefiting from the civic institutions that foster the development of the arts and sciences, and from the instruments of democracy that allow citizens to participate in the political process. Yet all this has come at a cost in two respects. First, in driving a wedge between humanity and nature, the very planet which had once offered nourishment and support for human life came to be seen as a repository of resources to be plundered, unloosing an unfettered extraction of materials on an industrial scale, which has ravaged the earth and jeopardized its capacity for renewal. And second, while the appeal to universal human entitlement serves the interests of those empowered to lay claim to it, for others, the forcible imposition of this claim has brought only oppression and impoverishment. In struggles for supremacy, the flag of humanity has always been flown by the victorious, treating as less than human those who have come under its yoke. And as these twin costs have inexorably risen, what began as an agenda for the emancipation of peoples from around the world has morphed into a vicious spiral of environmental destruction and social injustice. 300 years of progress, it seems, far from delivering humanity to a promised land of peace and plenty, leaves us looking into an abyss. For humanism, indeed, these are difficult times. Once regarded as a spur to growth and development, it now finds itself under attack from all sides, on both the right and the left of the political spectrum. From the right, humanism's promotion of individual freedom, liberal democratic governance, and the universal power of reason is routinely dismissed as the self-serving posturing of a cosmopolitan and meritocratic elite, determined to corner the benefits of wealth creation for itself while riding roughshod over deeply felt attachments to faith, ancestry, community, and nation among those left behind in the race to the top. Confidence in democracy is ebbing away, and even education is blamed for reserving the best jobs and most enviable lifestyles for the few who succeed, while dismissing everyone else as surplus to requirements. The shameless exploitation of the grievances of the downtrodden, above all by malign actors concerned to protect their own ill-begotten and often inherited wealth and privilege, largely accounts for the rise of right-wing populisms in many countries around the world. Fear and uncertainty, combined with a sense of having been forgotten or trampled underfoot in the great march of progress, drive many into the arms of unscrupulous regimes that think nothing of sacrificing their people for their own nefarious ends. Meanwhile, from the political left, humanism has been exposed as having provided ideological cover for a world historical project of colonization that has brought untold affluence for some, primarily in Europe, North America, and Australasia, at the expense of the enslavement or even genocide of others, the appropriation of their lands, and the devastation of their environments. As a direct or indirect result, vast numbers of people are now on the move in search of either safety or a better life, as their countries of origin, rendered increasingly uninhabitable due to environmental destruction and socio-political collapse, no longer offer any prospect for the future. Newer pathogens of humanism, such as corporate neoliberalism and algorithmic surveillance, are only exacerbating a precarious situation. And we are already witnessing the results in the form of climatic disruption. Competing fundamentalisms, each intolerant of variation in its midst, pushing all difference onto an absolute boundary between us and them, placing a patriotic duty on every inhabitant to protect the soil of the nation and its denizens from alien incursion. Such a barricaded world, as we know not only from history but also from today's armed conflicts, is hardly conducive to human flourishing. But on the other extreme, would we really want to discard the idea of making the world a more convivial and prosperous place for all? It is all too easy for intellectuals of post-humanist persuasion, who come predominantly from affluent countries and have enjoyed all the benefits of literacy, education, improved healthcare, and democratic governments, to pronounce that the days of humanism are now over. Would they then prefer a world without libraries, without colleges and universities, ravaged by preventable disease, and ruled by populist demagogues? This is no fantasy nightmare, since we are already seeing these things coming to pass before our very eyes and seem to lack the resolve to prevent them. And what are we to say to the millions of people around the world who are still denied access to even basic education, not to mention medical care and democratic representation? Are we to tell them that the ship of humanism has already sailed, that we are in a post-humanist world now? Are they to be left stranded, washed up by the tide of history? If we are to bequeath a habitable world to coming generations, then we cannot avoid these questions. Indeed, I believe we currently stand at a watershed no less momentous than that which faced our Enlightenment forebears of 300 years ago. And the challenge for us is this: do we have the courage, as they did, to usher in a new settlement that would inspire hope and expectation for the people of tomorrow? A settlement that our own descendants, another 300 years from now, will look back upon as equally foundational. And if so, what form should it take? What comes after humanism? Among the many competing visions of a post-humanist future, two presently stand out. One takes the divorce of reason from nature instituted in the Enlightenment to its ultimate conclusion, finally releasing reason from its moorings in fallible and earthbound human bodies. It would pitch us headlong into a regime of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and fully automated work. In this brave new world, even our own mortality would be a thing of the past, a distant memory. The other points in precisely the opposite direction, towards a state of affairs in which humanity, having been dethroned from its pedestal, finds itself at the mercy of a feral nature which has reclaimed the planet for itself and now runs rampant with utter disregard for human well-being. Whereas in the first scenario, human life itself, falling through the gap between outsourced minds and obsolete bodies, would be headed for extinction. In the second, humankind, having abdicated all responsibility for the ruins of its own creation and now banished to their hinterlands, would be disqualified from playing any further role in future planetary flourishing. Neither scenario, in my view, offers a viable path for humans to come. Supposing that human beings are still around 3 centuries from now, I wonder, were they to look back on the times we are living today, how they would judge the prophecies of our contemporary philosophers of post-humanism. My guess is that they would be less inclined to see the courageous birth of a new settlement than the final collapse of an old one in a mélange of wishful thinking and despair. Post-humanism, then, is not the answer. My contention is that the manifold crises of our age call not for a repudiation of humanism, but for its rejuvenation. In short, we need nothing less than a new humanism. But newness is not novelty. Part of the problem with the old humanism, indeed, lay in its unrelenting thirst for innovation, its insistence that the only way forward is to turn one's back on what has gone before. That is how progress works. Generation after generation, each claiming the present for itself, seeks to outdo or even discredit the constructions of its predecessors and to project its own designs onto an oncoming future. No sooner, however, has it trumpeted the birth of a new era than the next generation comes along, equally determined to supplant the constructions of the past with designs of its own. Thus are one generation's projects reduced to rubble by the ambitions of the next. And the result across generations is an accumulating pile of debris. The majority of the world's inhabitants are now fated to live among the ruins. Well, far from breaking this cycle of repudiation, post-humanism offers more of the same, except that the age now said to be upon us turns its back not just on previous generations, but on the entirety of human history, presaging nothing less than a new epoch in the story of the Earth. Geology unfolds this story as a sequence of epochs, of which the most recent, together making up the Quaternary period, are the Pleistocene, the Holocene, and now the Anthropocene. Human beings first appear in the story during the Pleistocene as Paleolithic hunters and gatherers, ostensibly still living along with other creatures in a state of nature. At that time, swathes of the northern hemisphere were covered with ice, presenting a formidable obstacle to human settlement. It was the melting of the ice at the onset of the Holocene, according to this narrative, that set the stage for history. A history that nevertheless only really got underway in the Neolithic, with the origins and spread of cultivation on newly exposed post-glacial soils. With that, humankind allegedly embarked on its career of domesticating nature, bringing it increasingly under control. But in our time, the ice is melting again, and as its last remnants are disappearing, and as ever more soils are either excavated to make way for industrial development or covered in concrete, we are now witnessing history's final denouement in the advent of the Anthropocene. It is no coincidence that in this geological narrative, the book of human history is confined to the epoch of the Holocene, sandwiched between the covers of the prehistoric Pleistocene on the one hand and the post-historic Anthropocene on the other. For some, the end of history heralds an eternity of total planetary oversight, in which the Earth system has been geoengineered by human design to run in perpetuity. For others, it augurs an era of catastrophic destruction as human activities unleash forces of a magnitude far beyond their control. Either way, for better or for worse, the fate of the planet is attributed to human intervention. There is, of course, no denying that life on Earth currently faces a crisis of gargantuan proportions. And nor can we disregard the role of human agency, especially in its more recent military and industrial phase, in bringing it on. Nevertheless, in the manner of its framing, this is but the latest version of an old story. Theorists of progress have always been inclined to believe that their own generation is on the point of opening the last envelope, and today's prophets of posthumanism are no exception. So where then did the old humanism go wrong? Perhaps its destiny was already sealed from the moment when philosophers of the Enlightenment in the Europe of the 18th century decreed that the future for humankind lay not in following in the footsteps of ancestors or in aligning the ways along which human lives are led with the ways of animals and plants with which they used to coexist, but in turning their backs on the worlds of nature and tradition to face resolutely in the opposite direction. According to the humanist myth of origin, it was in this one mighty moment, a turning point without precedent in the evolution of life, that true humanity emerged from its primordial roots and, guided by the light of reason, embarked on its long ascent towards civilization. Herein lay the promise of modernity. But with this turnaround, both human ancestral traditions and the lifeways of non-human species were consigned to a bygone path as a heritage to be preserved rather than a wellspring of renewal. Both nature and culture acquired their modern meanings in this inversion. Contrary to the claims of many contemporary scholars of a post-humanist disposition, the concept of nature is not itself an invention of the modern era, nor is the concept of culture. Both have been around for at least 2,000 years. What was new to modernity was the specific inflection given to these terms by way of their opposition to human reason and its interests. The word nature, in fact, comes from the Latin nascere, meaning to be born, and referred originally to a power distributed throughout the cosmos to bring forth new life. The word culture, also of Latin derivation, from colere, to cultivate, referred to the labors of nourishment or of nurture, committed to creating the conditions for this newborn life to flourish. But not only did the modern imagination strip nature of this power of natality from which it had taken its name, so likewise it stripped culture of its original connotations of nourishment. Instead, reflected in the rear-view mirror of advancing reason, nature reappears as something like a repository or a back catalogue of final forms, nowadays known as biodiversity, to be conserved for posterity, while culture figures as an archive of ancient traditions on the verge of disappearing, if not already rendered extinct, as they are overtaken by modernity. Now, in recent decades, anthropologists, including myself, have devoted much effort to showing that nothing corresponding to our concepts of nature and culture are to be found in the vocabularies of indigenous peoples from around the world. They were inventions of the West, we claimed, destined to be foisted through colonization upon the rest of the world. But I would now argue rather differently. There may indeed be nothing corresponding to nature and culture in their modern inflections. But this is no reason, however, to abandon the terms. On the contrary, I would hazard the hypothesis that there can be no people who continue to draw a living from the lands and waters of this earth, who lack the idea of a power at large in the cosmos to generate new life, and know people, likewise, who do not see it as their task to nurture this life in order that it may continue to reanimate the world for future generations. With this, nature and culture follow one another, just as in the cycle of life, the labors of birth give way to the work of nourishment. Restored thus to their original meanings of continuous birth and nurturance, the concepts of nature and culture are not only in tune with indigenous cosmologies, they also point the way towards an alternative settlement that could give hope to times to come. To achieve this settlement, however, will mean reversing the very turn that, for thinkers of the Enlightenment, first set humanity on the high road to civilization. In this turn, as we have seen, both nature and tradition were relegated to a now superseded past. What if we were to turn again, to retrace the very ways we had once put behind us, casting our lot with the lives of those who have gone before and those living around, facing in the same direction as they, in seeking a path into the future that we can take together. This future, after all, is not a problem to be solved. It is a life to be lived. And living it will mean relearning what it means to coexist, not just with fellow human beings, but with other creatures as well. It will mean exchanging the time of chronological succession, as generation replaces generation, with the duration of life itself, as it ceaselessly begets new forms. Herein, I believe, lies the possibility of a new humanism committed not to progress, but to the continuity of life. Just as the path to the future in this new humanism lies in retracing old ways, so it is through the recovery of their old meanings that the concepts of nature and culture indicate a way ahead. But this is equally true of the very idea of what it means to be human. For Enlightenment philosophers, as we have seen, the unique achievement of humanity lay in breaking through the bonds of nature that hold all other creatures in their grip. But even if the idea of humanity as a superior condition of being transcending the natural, even if this idea was a modern invention, the concept of human was not. Its roots are obscure, possibly having something in common with the Latin for ground or soil, that is humus, whence comes the verb for to bury, humando. Humans then would be creatures of the soil, reborn. Perhaps it would be better to treat to human as a verb and humaning as a task to be undertaken. This is a task not just of living life, but of leading it, of bios rather than zoe. It consists in nothing less than the ceaseless work of recreating ourselves, one another, and the world around us in the milieu of our common existence. Whereas humanity, according to the old humanism, is transcendent, humaning, according to the new, is immanent. It is immanent both in the power of nature to bring forth life and in the work of culture in its nourishment and care. And this, as we shall see, is what makes it exceptional. Now, before exploring the implications of this new humanism in greater depth, we need first to address two objections commonly leveled against the humanism of old. One is that it is anthropocentric, the other that it is Eurocentric. On closer inspection, neither charge really stacks up. On the first, thinkers of the Enlightenment, far from placing anthropos at the center of the cosmos, set out to achieve the precise opposite, that is, to decenter the human, above all, by detaching the faculty of reason, wherein the essence of humanity was supposed to reside, from any worldly involvement whatsoever, and placing it instead at the apex of a pyramid with the world at its feet. From this sovereign viewpoint, they supposed, the entirety of nature was revealed to human oversight. And on the second charge, while it is true that the Enlightenment project originated in Europe, at its heart was an appeal to the universality of reason, which repudiates any affiliation to place, region, or continent. Reason, being everywhere, belongs nowhere. If everyone is equally endowed with reason, as the old humanists believed, then it should in principle make no difference where they come from. True, most humanists of earlier centuries assumed that reason was cultivated to different degrees among different nations on a scale from primitive to civilized, and that in the nations of Europe from which they themselves predominantly came, it was cultivated to the highest degree. That they were biased towards their own kind is undeniable, but this bias was not intrinsic to their philosophy. But if the old humanism was literally innocent of both anthropocentrism and regional affiliation, then these are foundational to the new. This means acknowledging in the first place that humans really are exceptional compared to other than human inhabitants of the life world. Now, this claim is bound to be controversial. For the Enlightenment's many post-humanist critics, indeed, what they call human exceptionalism is a dangerous illusion. The illusion, however, lies in their belief that exceptionality necessarily implies superiority. This belief, in my view, is wholly unwarranted. What makes humans exceptional from the perspective of the new humanism adumbrated here is not that they are superior to beings of other kinds, nor are they driven by a will to dominate and control. Their disposition towards the world is characterized by something entirely different. We could call it a love for the world, amor mundi. It is a love born from a reverence for the creative power of nature, its natality, and enacted in the world of culture, in the work of culture, in nurturing the new life it brings forth. It is thanks to this love that humans carry a burden of responsibility not shared by other beings to sustain the balance of nature and ensure its fecundity for generations to come. It is a burden, however, that can be discharged only from a position at the beating heart of the world itself. That is why the new humanism is necessarily anthropocentric, in the strict sense of the term. Where the old humanism sought to decenter humanity, to place it on a pedestal, the new humanism aspires to the precise opposite, to recenter the human, to situate it in the midst of things, from which emplaced center, human beings can foster relations with the earth and its manifold inhabitants on a foundation of care. The key question remains, however, why should humans, of all creatures, be alone in shouldering this labor of love, this responsibility of caring for the world? My answer is that they do so in return for the world's bestowal upon them of a priceless gift, namely the gift of language. But this is not language as it was understood by philosophers of the Enlightenment. For them, language was above all an instrument of reason. And reason speaks with one voice and one alone, regardless of the identity or background of the speaker. In the new humanism, by contrast, language manifests itself in the first place as a polyphony of voices, a chorus, each continually brought forth in its solicitation of the voices of others, and each issuing from somewhere in the world, resounding to the depths of the region to which it belongs, and of the relations it entertains with co-inhabitants. That is why attachment to place and region, so foreign to the old humanism, is fundamental to the new. These voices, however, do not belong only to humans. Multiple other phenomena can have their voices too. The whispering trees, the babbling brook, the roaring thunder. Yet these voices sound only in the ears of humans. It is by lending their ears, that is, their oral attention to other than human beings, that each is given a voice and can join the chorus. It is a chorus, however, that in its entirety only humans can hear. And since they alone can hear it, only they can respond. That is why they bear a burden of responsibility that other creatures do not. In the new humanism, in short, language is an instrument not of reason, but of responsibility. And it is an instrument that is played not from atop the world, but from within its midst. Well, let me now pick up the narrative of transition from a human to a post-human world from where I left off, with humanity precariously perched at the dawn of a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. Would it make any sense to people of this time, that is us, to be told that the Holocene is over, that with it history is at an end, and that we are about to enter a terminal phase of post-history? We might wonder, indeed, whether the idea of prehistory would have made any more sense to our Paleolithic ancestors when they walked the earth. It is not as though they were perched at the cliff edge of history, looking out over the vast adventure opening out ahead of them. They were merely carrying on with their lives and could not have known where it would all lead. The same surely goes for us today. It is no more possible in practice to distinguish events that allegedly set the stage for history from those of the history they inaugurated than it is to distinguish the events of this history from those supposed to bring it to a close. Earlier, I posed the question of what human beings 3 centuries from now would make of our contemporary prognoses for the future. But it is worth turning the question around. What can we today say of people living 300 years from now? Thinkers of the Enlightenment, after all, might have asked just the same question of us. It is hard to know, of course, what kinds of lives our distant descendants might be living, but we can be fairly certain of 3 things. First, these people will still need to eat, and for this they will have to labor on the earth and under the sky to grow their food, albeit under climatic conditions markedly different from those we encounter today. Moreover, as an ever-increasing proportion of the world's human population lives in cities, it is likely that for our descendants, cities will have become centers of food production as well as habitation. Climatic changes and the disuse of fossil fuels will have made it impossible to move food supplies across the globe from rural regions of production to urban centers of consumption, as happens today. By then, agriculture and urban planning will have merged into a single discipline, tasked with creating environments for life at high densities. Perhaps this discipline would even find models from civilizations of the distant past, long sidelined by narratives of enlightenment, such as in Mesoamerica and East and Southeast Asia. Second, these humans to come will still be endowed, as we are, with organs of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, with mouths, lips, and vocal cords, with a full complement of fingers and toes, and with a nervous system that extends throughout the body and possibly beyond. In other words, they will have bodies much like ours, capable of looking and feeling where they are going, of responding with sensitivity and precision to variations in environmental conditions, of working with the hands and walking on 2 feet, and of communicating by speech and gesture. They will be social beings, as we are, but also beings whose lives are rooted in the places they collectively inhabit and the lands they know. But third, the technology that has come to define our present era and that underwrites its promise finally to release humanity into a post-historic age will have long since imploded, along with all that depends on it: telecommunications, the internet, artificial intelligence, and robotics. For this technology, in order to function, will have placed demands on the earth and its inhabitants that turned out to be simply unsustainable. They included the enslavement of large numbers of people in often appalling conditions, to the extraction of the rare and highly toxic heavy metals required for digital operations, and the expenditure of vast quantities of energy used to fuel the supercomputers and to blast into space the thousands of satellites needed to keep the whole system running. Even though we of the present cannot tell exactly how the digital era will implode, whether gradually or in one catastrophic event, we can be confident that it will do so eventually. When this will happen is anyone's guess, though I am inclined to apply the 150-year rule. Coal's heyday lasted from the 1810s to the 1960s. The age of oil and gas began in the 1910s and will last perhaps until the 2060s. On that score, the digital era, starting in the 1980s, has until the 2130s. 3 centuries on then, our descendants will find themselves depending on all the bodily skills, senses and skills at their disposal to eke out a livelihood at high concentrations on an earth and under the heavens that, thanks to the designs and technologies of the present, have become veritable junkyards of defunct devices. Yet, even as we turn our backs on past generations, and even with the story of the Anthropocene on history itself, we continue to envisage a post-historic future that turns this reality back to front. In this vision, our bodily organs of action and perception are destined for extinction, while digital technology is miraculously self-sustaining. Instead of a human future that is post-digital, we cling to the idea of a digital future that is post-human. In this imagined future, so-called smart cities, far from being centers of food production, will have become hubs of creativity whose inhabitants, already offloaded into their devices, will have lost all connection with the earth. They could just as well be enclosed in glass bubbles, floating offshore on artificial islands, orbiting in space, or even set down on other planets. If citizens still have eyes, ears, and other organs of sense, these will have been reduced to portals, mediating a flow of information that connects them in a vast but entirely disembodied and placeless neural network. In this fully digitized world, fingers and toes, the original digits of the human body, will have become mere appendages, relics of an evolutionary past now irrevocably superseded. And what passes for social life will no longer have anything to do with living, working, and eating together. It will be a function not of bodily conviviality, but of network connectivity. Now, this vision may seem far-fetched, but it is already impacting on the designs of the present. And let me give an example. It concerns writing. For millennia, literate people around the world have been used to write by hand, a practice involving close hand-eye coordination in the precise enactment of micro-gestures that shape the letters or characters traced on the page. Whenever I inscribe letters with my pen, I pick up the lines of the past and carry them on in gestures that have traveled from hand to hand through a process of copying involving both imitation and emulation over countless generations. Yet, increasingly today, we tap our words in a standardized typeface on digital keyboards while directing our gaze at the screen on which they are projected. Here, the links between hand and eye and between gesture and trace are broken. Writing, in the sense of inscribing a line in a surface, has become a thing of the past. So many adults find themselves losing skills of handwriting diligently learned in childhood, while for a new generation raised on keypads, they are already deemed obsolete. The loss is incalculable. Banishing the expressive force of gesture and trace is equivalent in writing to silencing the expressive power of the voice in speech. A society without handwriting would be like one without song, in which what had once been a chorus of voices is reduced to the monotonous patter of an information system. After writing, will speech be the next victim of digitization? Will the affective powers of the voice be expelled from speaking, just as keypad and screen have expelled them from the hand, from those of the hand, from writing? And will digital synthesizers be left to assemble messages from standardized speech sounds? Speaking and writing are precious gifts, all the more so when digital technology self-destructs, as it inevitably will. And the same goes for all those skills of livelihood on which the continued survival of humans to come will ultimately depend. Let me suggest another example by inviting you to compare two things. On the one hand, a laptop computer, on the other, a loaf of bread. They weigh about the same, and although of rather different shape, one rather flat, the other lumpy, they are of roughly similar volume. Both are products of human artifice and draw for their manufacture on a range of materials and techniques. And both, for most of us today, are things we cannot do without. Yet loaves of bread have been baked for at least 8,000 years, whereas the laptop computer has been with us for no more than 40 years. Which of these two things, the loaf and the laptop, will outlast the other? Now, advocates of digital post-humanism would put their money on the computer. It is time to turn our back on the loaf, they would say, including the laborious business of preparing the soil, growing and harvesting the crop, milling and baking. Why, the digital post-human may not even need to eat, for surely technology will finally solve the problem of life and death, relieving us from the drudgery of having to inhabit aging and increasingly decrepit bodies. But post-digital humanism, by contrast, would side with the loaf. If it has been with us already for 8 millennia, then there is no reason in principle why it should not endure for another 8 millennia. But for reasons already outlined, the days of the laptop are numbered, even if the toxic residues from discarded devices may continue to stain the earth for thousands of years. Neither the loaf nor the laptop, of course, exists in isolation. Both are embedded in far-flung webs of relations. But the principles on which these relations are constructed are diametrically opposed from one another. For the loaf, they are founded on an immediate, sensuous bodily involvement with place and materials, of feet with soil and hands with dough, as well as in the collaboration and commensality of working and eating together. Bread is not just a glutinous web of organic fibers. It is also a web of human beings in community. For the laptop, by contrast, it is a web that, while celebrating connectivity, is almost entirely disconnected from bodily sensibilities, as well as from place and community. Much of it is invisible and insensible, extending around the globe in an estimated 1 million miles of fiber optic cable and the thousands of communications satellites already orbiting the planet. But most fundamentally of all, the loaf and the laptop embody different kinds of time. The temporality of bread making is bound up with the agricultural cycle, itself tied to the annual cycle of the seasons and to the vagaries of weather. This is a time that carries on without in any way advancing. The loaves we bake today, just like the letters we handwrite, may be a bit different, but are no advance on those baked or written 8,000 years ago, and incidentally can be traced to the same source in ancient Sumeria. The laptop, by contrast, is absolutely tied to linear chronological time. It is this that allows users randomly distributed over the surface of the globe to achieve virtual simultaneity. A minute, an hour, a day are precisely the same, whatever the place, weather, or season. Perhaps then we might contrast bread time or handwriting time with laptop time. And I now want to link this contrast to my earlier remarks about the passage of generations. We modern people, still basking in the afterglow of the Enlightenment, remain addicted to the idea of progress. Armed with this idea, we are convinced that each generation is destined to supplant its predecessors, projecting its own allegedly superior vision for the future over those that went before. Generation thus follows generation as a series of layers, alternately covering and covered. For people who think like this, only if the new supplants the old, thrusting it back into the past, never to resurface, can we be confident that progress is being made. Here, novelty is the name of the game, for without innovation, there is no progress, and without progress, no future. The laptop, in this sense, belongs to a history of progress, but the loaf and handwriting do not. Novelty or innovation is one thing, however, renewal or rejuvenation quite another. And there is renewal only in following old ways, not turning our backs on previous generations, but retracing their footsteps. In this view, the ancestors are always before us. They are our future, while we come behind. As they look after us, we follow in their care. We owe it to coming generations then to recover both our love for the world that our predecessors have bequeathed to us and our responsibility to look after it with care and compassion. And this includes taking care of the skills on which, in times to come, our descendants will depend. It is the great tragedy of the modern age to have sacrificed its love for the world on the altar of innovation. As a result, on current projections, we risk losing skills that have been honed over millennia within a single generation. Once lost, they may never be restored. This is the height of irresponsibility. And it is why, in conclusion, I call for a new humanism, a post-digital humanism, which, as in the activities of handwriting and bread making, is dedicated not to the supplanting of generations, but to the renewal of life. Thank you very much.
I and a few colleagues had a chance to share tea and chat with Professor Ingold this Saturday. Various issues mentioned in today's lecture, including handwriting, lines, weaving, and AI, were discussed. One thing in particular fascinated me, that is philosophy. When I first read Professor Ingold's paper, very philosophical was my first impression. Luckily, he shared his paper before his lecture. I told my wife, otherwise I would not be able to understand many deep thoughts he intended to convey today. His philosophy and poetic writing were certainly mentioned in our conversation that day. But our conversation let me understand that his works are very anthropological also, despite his way of thinking probably goes way beyond our common anthropological concerns, no matter it is because of our academic training or our academic environment we find ourselves in. His lecture and his being here with us, I believe, broaden our views and remind us that we should be brave in putting these views into academic writings, to which I would like to express my gratitude here. Please allow me to share one more story before opening the floor for questions and discussions. Professor Ingold told me that he and our last year speaker, the scholar, are good friends. In French anthropology, students are required to learn lots of philosophy, while in British anthropology, none is taught. For the scholar, he was a kind of escaping from philosophy to find anthropology. But for Professor Ingold, it's the other way around. He finds inspiration from philosophy. They pass by each other and at times argue with each other, he said. I believe if our colleague Li Yih-yuan were here with us today, he would love to see these discussions being continued and smile when looking at us. Okay, I shall stop here and open the floor for questions. Anyone?
Thank you, Professor Ingold, for the wonderful talk. And I really appreciate your talk. And I have a question, about your new humanism. If in your new humanism, there is no bad person, bad country, bad nation, and why we still need love with responsibility? You call for love, not for fight, right? And to continue life is to continue the life that continue to destroy the earth. So this reminds me of Karl Marx. He organized the revolutionary consciousness of the proletariat to end the continuous terrible life. So in your imagine that we are so isolated in the future world. So where it comes from the love? Thank you.
So if I understood right, the question is where does this love come from exactly? That is so important, and how? And you referred to Karl Marx and his idea of a revolutionary consciousness. First, this idea of revolution is very interesting because revolution means a turnaround, and that's exactly what I was talking about. And Marx was a very modernist thinker. At least the later Marx was. The early Marx wasn't, but the later Marx, when he started talking about revolutions, he had a really, really modern view about how the way to achieve the future is by turning our back on the past. And that's what revolution meant. We should completely turn our backs on old ways and face towards the future. So that was exactly embodies the kind of modernist perspective I was thinking about. I spoke of love for the world, and this idea, amor mundi, comes primarily from the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt published a book, very famous book, I think it was 1958, called The Human Condition. But when she began drafting the book, before it was published, she wrote to a friend saying that she was thinking of writing this book and she was going to call it Amor Mundi, Love for the World. And then she changed her mind. But that's really what it's about. And Hannah Arendt was writing in the aftermath of the Second World War. And what she was trying to show was that despite all its evils, despite all its atrocities, we have to, so to speak, confront the world as it is. Let the world be itself, to relate to that and find a way of coming to be with it. So, and that's what she meant by love. To explain it, maybe I could refer to the work of a modern philosopher of education, Gert Biester, very much influenced by Arendt, who is talking about art and art's role in education. And he argues that confronted with a world or confronted with a work of art, there are three things we could do. There are three alternatives. One would be confronted with something, we shall dominate it, we shall take it over. That would be world destroying. Another would be, this is too much, we will retreat from it, we will give up. That would be self-destroying. The third alternative is to say, well, I am here and the world is there. I am I, the world is there. We must begin to realize, accept each other on our own terms and begin a dialogue. And that is about love. That is about, rather than either dominating or surrender or retreating, to, in a way, holding your ground and trying to understand, letting the world be and trying to understand the world as it is. So the greatest dilemma for us in taking that approach, and for me too, is if we are to love the world, if we are to honor our ancestors, what if the world is really bad and our ancestors did really bad things? It's a very difficult question to answer, but the only answer I have is that even if the world looks bad, even if our ancestors look bad, it's only because of our ancestors live and because the world is there that we exist. We owe our existence to those ancestors and to that world, whatever they did and however bad it was. And therefore we have to find a way of coexisting together with the world. And that then offers possibility for the future. So that's the best answer I can give. It's not a perfect answer. We don't have to accept that the world is all beautiful and everything is lovely. That's not what love is about. Love is about admitting that the world is there and allowing it to speak for itself and engaging with that as it is. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Professor Ingold. You mentioned in many places that anthropology is about education. We are studying with the world, not of the world. And what could be more important than teaching intro to anthropology? So with this new humanism that you propose, so this question is on behalf of many lecturers teaching intro to anthropology in different levels. How would you structure your course? What were the main points you will emphasize when teaching intro? Surely it won't be just about emphasizing on handwriting for students. Because I'm also teaching intro now, and that's what I'm most curious about.
Very much. I mean, much of this began actually from my own experience of much of these ideas that I presented began from my own experience of teaching way back when I was still based in the University of Manchester. And I did what everybody else did. I was giving lectures. I was sitting in front of classes of students and telling them what they were supposed to know and or what I thought they should know. And the students said to me, and I was talking, I was part of my teaching was about questions of knowledge transmission. I was interested in language and culture and technology and talking about these issues. And the students said to me, but what you are telling us about anthropological studies of learning in other cultures does not fit with what you are doing. You're telling us that in other cultures, people learn by doing, on the job, in families. But here you are, standing up here, telling us things. There is a contradiction. And I said, yes, indeed, there is a contradiction. And that was a challenge for me to think, how can I change my practice in such a way that it is resonant with practices, what we know from anthropology about the way in which people generally come to know the things that they do. And now I have tried to do that. For example, in the course that I taught for many years called the 4 A's, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art and Architecture, I asked students to write by hand and to compare their experience of writing by hand with their experience of writing on the computer as part of their project work. And I got great pleasure from being able to write in the handbook. When students take a course, they get a course handbook, which gives all the rules and regulations about how they have to type their essay using Times 12 New Roman. Everything has to be done just that. And I took great pleasure in writing a course handbook and saying, you are going to write by hand. And it's a sort of subvert this move towards standardization of everything. But there are two principles that I think are terribly important and that I have tried to embody in my own teaching. One is that the students who you're teaching are just as intelligent as you are. Never, ever to talk down to them. They're just as, they might not know, they might not have read the books you've read or have thought so much about the things you've thought about. So your job is to introduce them to these things and to share these ideas, but never to think that in order for them to understand, you have to simplify, to present things in a artificial form that is somehow packaged so as to make it easy for them. The whole point is to, if things are difficult, then they're difficult. And it's a challenge for all of us together. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is to think of every occasion when you meet with students, it might be a lecture or a seminar, as a kind of event, as a performance, analogous to a concert in music, where when you're performing, you're creating the sound and people can listen and join in and in their own minds join in the production of the event, so that teaching is a process of production, not for the students. Teaching is production, not consumption. They're not there as consumers to consume what is being presented to them. They are like an audience in a concert. They are there as co-producers, actually joining in this collective process of generating knowledge and understanding. And I've always felt that as an anthropologist, just like all my colleagues, I've spent far more of my life with students than I ever have doing fieldwork or even in research. And I've probably learned more from that process than anything else. And one of the scandals, I think, even today in anthropology, is that while we acknowledge the contribution of the people among whom we work to our knowledge, we don't acknowledge the contribution of the students we work with. And I think that is really a scandal that we need to address. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is about ethnography. Yeah, how do we apply this new humanism, in our ethnographic studies? I really like the idea that this new humanism is a responsibility for the renewal of life. But anthropologists have told us, people in the world might have very different ideas about the renewal of life and what brings renewal of life to the world. For example, the people I study in the Philippines, they are headhunters, and headhunting was considered, the most important goal in achieving this regeneration of life. And so, so if culturally people can have very different ideas, how do you apply this concept of new humanism? And then the second one is about new humanism as political action. You have said in the lecture that the achievement of enlightenment, this progress is made at the cost of many people, decolonized people outside Europe, North America, Australia, and then people in the world has suffered the result of enlightenment. And now you are proposing that this new humanism is a responsibility for all of us on the earth. And so I like the idea, but how do we really politically put it in action? That's my question. Thank you.
It's a big question, so thank you very much, and challenging ones too. I would guess that wherever we work, among whatever people, the renewal of life would be considered important. The question is about how do you go about it, and people you've worked with would say you have to hunt heads. People where I come from would definitely not say that. So that there are these differences, and that's where it becomes challenging. My view is that when we work with people as anthropologists, our concern is to engage with those people to have a conversation about how we should live our lives. And on those grounds, I have tried to distinguish between ethnography and anthropology. That whereas ethnography is about trying to understand what people think, what they know, putting it in the context, making sense of it, that's all fine. Anthropology is not making studies of people, but making studies with people. That is, we go to study with people, together with people, in order to learn from their experience as part of an inquiry into what the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world are. So the fundamental question for anthropology is not how do this people live or how do that people live, how should we live? That's a fundamental ethical question. And we go to study with other people. If you think of every way of life as an experiment in living, everybody's trying to figure out how to live. And every life is an experiment. And we can learn from all these experiments in trying to figure out how to live. And so what anthropology is doing when we go to work with other people is drawing into this conversation about how to live, what are the possibilities of life. We draw into the conversation people, such as those you have worked with in the Philippines, who otherwise would not be part of it. We draw them in so that their experience is something we can draw on. Now, it might well be that we find some aspects of people's experience or what people have to share with us, we might find it abhorrent. We might disagree with it profoundly. But that is not to say that we might not learn something from it. And that's why I believe that as anthropologists, we should have our own voice beyond the voice of simply representing the knowledge and understanding of others. So we can do our best in ethnographic work to explain to our readers why people in the Philippines hunt heads and why they think it's important for the regeneration of life. That is fine. But as anthropologists, we need to go beyond that to say that having had all these conversations, done all this thinking, all this reading, this is what we think. And we might conclude that actually hunting heads is not a good way to live. And that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion, and say that we've come to that conclusion because we've actually talked to people who think it is a good way to live, and we've understood what they're saying, we've learned from their experience. We might do the same with neo-Nazis or all sorts of horrible people we could talk to, but the important thing is that we bring as many people as possible into the conversation about how to live. And that's why I think anthropology is perhaps the only discipline that does that, that really genuinely takes what other people say seriously and thinks, how might this help us understand the human condition? And I think that's what it's really about. And politically, the key thing is to recognize that this conversation is one that involves all of us collectively. I wrote an article a while ago which is called One World Anthropology. And my purpose there was to argue that politically, it is really important to understand that the conversation about how to live is a conversation for everybody. And it was a critique of the common anthropological idea that there are all these different worlds. And people in the Philippines are in one world, and I'm in my world, and you're in your world. And there are all these different worlds, and our job is to understand other cultural worlds. We always want to pluralize worlds, not to bring them into dialogue with one another. And I think the really important thing politically is to recognize the oneness of the world we inhabit. And that oneness is not the unity, it's not what the sociologist John Law once called the one world world. He meant by the one world world and the world of corporate technoscience, the world of British Airways, the world of international communications. That's different. The one world I'm talking about is a world of infinite difference. But the key point is that it's our differences. It's like an enormous conversation in which every voice is different. But it's because these voices are going along together and responding to one another that we are also together. So it's ever emerging difference that's the glue that holds us together. And the more we can open up the conversation about how to live to everybody, the more we'll be able to hang together as one world. That, I think, is the so politically, the key thing is to be clear about the distinction between differentiation and division. Get away from the idea that differences divide people. Actually, it's differences that bring people together. This is the key, absolutely critical point. And I think that's the key to a democratic politics, is that we recognize that it's differences that actually bind people together in a single conversation.
Okay, Professor Ingold, thank you very much for your wonderful manifesto. Actually, I have two questions. First one is related to the one previously raised by my colleague, Yang Xun. It's also about political. The new, the old humanism, as you put it, has given rise to many countless political forms and ideology the past 2 centuries, like liberalism, post-colonialism, new liberalism, political left and political right, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, you name it. But with the new humanism and the old new humanism, old fight to get out the human differences in one way or the other. I'm wondering what's the difference between new humanism from the old humanism that they all try to reconcile the differences when it come down to conversation, when it comes down to conflicts. What are the practice or rules that can accommodate as many differences as many possible? That's my first question. The second question would be the ethical one. Is there any ethical line between not to love and love too much, or why should I love this guy or this species? Is any ethical guideline to tell us what should I love this species? That's my 2 questions. Thank you.
The first question, in a sense, is what is new about the new humanism? And I think partly to put this in context, I see this as a critique of post-humanism. I find that much of the literature in post-humanism, which has become in anthropology very big, I find this inadequate. I see in a lot of post-humanist writing more of the same. Really, I don't see a really courageous attempt to face up to where we are and offer hope for the future. I want to find a way ethically, I want to find a way how we can be good ancestors, to think about our descendants, 300 years time, many generations, to think not just about the next 20 years, the next 50 years, think about the next 300 years. And how can we be good ancestors? And I think that post-humanists are not setting a good example, and I want to find a better one. So that in a way is the motive behind all of this, and at the same time to emphasize the distinction between newness and novelty. And this word new is difficult, but I want to get away from the idea of innovation. Many people now are saying we should be talking more about repair, for example. We should start about repair rather than innovation. And repair means, in a sense, going back the way you were before. I don't want to think about it as just another ideology, just another ism, I think in the same sort of way, I have a great admiration for those scholars, those philosophers who launched the Enlightenment in Europe 300 years ago. These were really courageous people. They were thinking in a big way. They really, we might criticize their ideas now, but in terms of the ambition, the scope, the farsightedness, these were great minds doing wonderful things. And just think about what the consequences of their thinking were for human beings over the past 3 centuries. Absolutely enormous and largely beneficial. So when we look back, but not anymore. And I think, so I'm trying to think that I don't want to say here, I don't want to propose yet another ism. I want to say in a way that we a different approach to scholarship, to thinking. And I think that's, so if you say what's new about the new humanism, I would say that it's about realizing that we are heading in the same direction as the people who went before us. And we're not facing in the other direction. Maybe to explain, I can just tell one simple theory. It's a simple story. I was writing this book about generations and how we think about generations. And I wanted an image to help me think about the view I wanted to propose. And the image was this. Suddenly occurred to me one morning. That imagine that up there in the front is an ice cream, a van selling ice cream. And there is a queue of people waiting to buy the ice cream. So the people who are near the ice cream van, they're about to get it. And the people who came later, you'll have to wait a bit, but you're eventually there. So the people who were there before you are where you are going to be. Now imagine generations like that, everybody moving forward, each generation, and then imagine that in the queue, you suddenly decide to turn around, put your hand up, and say to all those people coming after you, I am the present, stop. And then the next people will have to advance towards the ice cream. They have to bang into you and take over, and they will then say, I am the present. And I suddenly saw in this image the predicament that we're at, that each generation turns around, turns its back on that which went before and says, we are the present. And we will project our ideas onto the future. And you are coming towards us. And when it's your generation's turn, then you will turn your back on us and you will project something in the future. And so we end up with this accumulation of presence, and we call that progress. So my sense is that we need to, we've got our temporality wrong, and we need to turn around and face in the other direction. And I thought actually for most of human history it's been like that. This post-Enlightenment phase historically is very anomalous. It's only for a few hundred years compared with millennia. So that's that's a sort of answer to your question about what's new about it. It's really old. The ethical question is much more difficult to answer. I introduced the concept of love because I wanted to stress that this is actually an ethical issue. And as I said about anthropology, the fundamental question of anthropology for me is how should we live? And if we take away that question, then anthropology doesn't mean anything. And that means that, and we ask the question, how should we live? It doesn't mean that can we lay down some guidelines? It means that we have continually to be creating some guidelines as we go along. It's an improvisation. Our job in life is to try and create some sort of guidelines that will help the people who will come after us. And these guidelines are things that we're continually formulating as we go along. So if I get back to my point that every way of life is an experiment in living it, and that the best we can do is to try and learn from these experiments in order to find a way of carrying on. But of course, there's no such thing as a final solution. Heaven forbid. The final solutions have always been disastrous for humanity. So we must just keep on. There's no, that's why I said that the future is not a problem to be solved, it's a life to be lived. And we just have to muddle along. But muddling along is an ethical task. That's.
No hands here. So the one in the front first, okay.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Tim Ingold. I'm really impressed by your really broad vision and deep reflection on civilization and humanity's fate. I'm especially impressed by your emphasis on the touch, on love and care of nature and our responsibility towards it. But I'm a little bit puzzled by the proposition you proposed at the end of your talk, which is between the choice of a loaf of bread and this laptop, which I have in front of me. Because for me, it seems like either a loaf of bread or a piece of steak we are enjoying today, they really cannot be produced without the aid of science and technology. And they've been deeply penetrated by human interference into the natural world. And it not only happened since the Enlightenment, this human intervention into the natural world in order to create food for us has happened thousands has been happening had existed for thousands of years. So it seems to me as if there are not really two roads in front of us, because the two roads are simply so intertwined and each enabling the other. And it just seems unable to untangle them from each other. So I don't know if the loaf of bread to me seemed like a romantic view of human history, as if we are only able to live, as we are able to still live in a pristine nature without the aid of science and technology. But are these really the two choices facing us, which we are forced to make a choice today? So to me, I'm still thinking about whether this is a valid question. And to me, the choice is just impossibly difficult to make. So as I did, I ate a piece of bread this morning, and I have a laptop in front of us. I think I just am not able to give up either one or the other. And the other question which I just come up a little bit earlier, I think that's related to the previous question. I sort of, because I came from a historical background, and I sort of feel that you seem to have painted too rosy a picture of our historical past. And I studied the Enlightenment period, especially agriculture in the Enlightenment period. And it was exactly since the Enlightenment that humans started to have this ambition to control nature. In their talks, in the text, we can see repeated reminder or repeated claim of humans wanting to alter nature, to twist nature, even to torture nature in order to aid humankind, to provide happiness and sustain humankind in the world. So For me, I do understand your point of having some reference for people who have gone before us and who have created so many good things that we have in today's world. But I'm sort of thinking that those people in the past, in the Enlightenment, they're perhaps just like people. They're perhaps just like people like us. They're good, trying to make the best for the humankind. But at the same time, they are also so guilty of creating so many troubles, which existed until today. So these are my question and a little bit of comment.
Thank you very much. Just before we get on to the loaf of bread, I feel I should offer an apology because I wrote this sitting in my home in Scotland, where of course we have a bin full of bread and we're eating it all the time. And I'm now in a country where you don't eat bread all the time, you eat rice. And I feel perhaps I universalize the loaf of bread in a way that is not appropriate in this part of the world, and that I should have referred to rice-based products rather than a wheat-based product. But hopefully you will forgive my Eurocentrism on that particular score. But you made the point that the loaf of bread, we don't know actually exactly when humans first started baking bread, but there's archaeological evidence from, I believe, what is now Turkey, of loaves going back to 8,000 years before Christ, that is 10,000 years before the present. So it's been going on a long time, and of course, long before anybody had any idea about using science and technology to dominate and control nature. There's a classic paper by the anthropologist Stephen Guterman where he compares European and ideas with the ideas of peasant farmers in Colombia, among whom he worked in his field work, and where they talk about these farmers who are cultivating, I can't remember, whatever the staple crops are for their everyday food, say that they're helping. It's the force of nature that produces the food. They're acting like midwives. They're helping in their work is to help nature bring forth, and they're then benefiting from the bounty of that. And he was also arguing that there were some currents of European thought which had the same idea. So it's possible to hold on to this idea that when you make a loaf of bread, you start with the crop, and very early times people were harvesting wild grasses, naturally growing grasses in meadows, harvesting the seeds and using those seeds then to make flour and then to bake bread before they actually started cultivating wheat or barley or cereal crops in the way that happens today. So this wasn't a sort of scientific or technological intervention as such, but I should perhaps just give you the story of how it is that I came to think of this example of the loaf and the laptop. It's because a year ago, I was fortunate enough to be invited by a collective arts project in the north of Italy, where what they were, it was on the outskirts of the city of Milan. What they wanted to do was to introduce children to the idea of, to get children to understand where their bread comes from. So they bought some land, and they planted the land with wheat, and they brought in lots of local school children, and the children were involved in the planting of the wheat, the harvesting of the wheat, in the milling of the flour, and in actually kneading the dough and putting it in the oven, so that they really got an understanding of the entire process, which leads to a loaf of bread, which otherwise they would have just bought from the shop, knowing nothing about it. And the idea was then they purchased a lorry, and they put a baking oven inside the lorry, and they were going to go around Italy doing workshops with young people to introduce them into this whole process. Of course, it has a technological aspect to it, but what was really crucial to it is the idea that they understand that this is part of an entire cycle. That was one inspiration, and the other inspiration is my favorite painting ever. It's a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, the Dutch painter from the 17th century. It's called The Harvest, and it shows harvesters at work in the fields, and they're cutting the wheat. The wheat is being carried down to the village, and right in the middle of the picture is a group of laborers who are taking a break, and they're cutting a loaf of bread and they're eating it. So you see the whole cycle there, and that's what I really wanted to get at. This sense that when we consume bread, we're entering into a cycle which includes or which depends upon the power of, we call it nature, to bring forth a crop, and then the power to look after that and nurture it, nature and culture in those original senses. Now, this second question, this is an accusation that I very often, or criticism, that people often tell me that I am presenting too rosy a picture of life altogether. And it's quite difficult to counteract that criticism. You're entirely right, and I think I pointed out too, that the other side of the Enlightenment was both environmental devastation and sometimes genocidal oppression to people. We know, we're all too aware that that you couldn't have one without the other. That the whole Enlightenment project, some would say, depended on slavery. That the two go hand in hand. So there is always what we might call a dark side to human history, and I don't suppose that will ever end. I'm not suggesting some sort of rosy picture in which everything is peace and love. I imagine in the future there will be a dark side to history, just as there has been always in the past. And I don't think it's our job to eradicate that. What I'm arguing for is a sense of the continuity of life. And then you could argue that it is not our job to cast moral judgment on, because we all know that the moral judgments change in history. People who now, for example, we say that those people who owned slaves were very bad people. A century ago, there are statues everywhere. They're heroes. So moral judgments do change throughout history. It's very difficult to get up and say we can make an absolute moral judgment on whether about our ancestors, were they good people or bad people. What we can say is that we owe our existence to the fact that they lived. And that, I think, is in a sense the key thing. When we're honoring the past, when we're honoring our ancestors, we're not saying my ancestor was a really good person, or perhaps that my ancestor was a really bad person. We are saying our ancestors lived and they went before us, and we are here because of them. And that's it. But I appreciate that this is tricky.
It's really not meant as a criticism.
No, I understand. But it's something that's worried me a lot. In thinking about this, that we talk about honoring our ancestors, It's something that most indigenous people do as a matter of course. It's on, but in the West, we're taught almost to do the opposite, to forget about them. They were in the past, they're finished now. But the problem is, how do we honor our ancestors in a way that does not get tied down to the particular facts of what this or that ancestor did or did not do, in a way that gets it, that I think that there's some sort of distinction between honoring a life that has been lived and reckoning on its particular deeds that life entailed and the consequences they had. But it's a very difficult distinction to make, and I'm still struggling with it.
Thank you very much. Now I understand more about how your thought and ideas can come. We appreciate
Professor Ingold, thank you for coming to Taipei and giving us this wonderful talk. And I've been reading your books in recent years. I find them very inspiring. And particularly, so therefore, I look for many of your talks online. I listen to them. So I was a bit curious whether you have your cello with you today. Obviously not. So I like your ideas that you see the way that you see the relationship between human and other than human as in continual correspondence. So I find it a bit curious when you said today that only humans can hear. And since they alone can hear it, only they can respond. So if we are kind of in a mutual correspondence with the world, so how can humans, and only humans can hear? So I feel a bit contradictory with your theory. So I would like to know more. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been struggling with this question too, and I don't know whether I quite resolved it yet. I felt that particular bit of the argument. There's a lot more to be worked out before I can become clear on that. I mean, just on the first question, unfortunately, I don't have my cello with me, and every time I go away for a week or 2 or 3, my cello gets very angry. And when I get back and I sit down to play, that doesn't want to make any sort of sound, and you have to gradually coax it back and so on. So I shall have to work on with my cello when we get back. But this is a really difficult problem about hearing and listening. There was the great biologist, founder of biosemiotics, Jakob von Uexküll, writing in the 1930s, had this wonderful image of the world of nature as being like almost like a symphony, where all the different creatures, plants and animals, were like melodic lines carrying on together. And that the whole world then was this symphony of lines in which each is responding to the others. But so that each plant, each animal is like an instrument in the orchestra and is carrying on. But it was only the biologist walking through the world who could hear the symphony itself. And this is the problem, that it's like imagining an orchestra in which every player of an instrument is maybe listening to and responding to those other instruments that directly affect its life at that moment, but not the whole thing. But somehow humans are able to hear the whole thing. And I'll give you one example of how I began to think about this question. You know that there's an old philosophical puzzle which goes like this. If a tree falls in a storm and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? And of course, the answer depends on what you mean by sound. If you take sound in a purely physicist sense and mechanical vibrations in the air, then there's a big bang when the tree falls. But if you mean sound as it's experienced by a human ear, then if there are no ears about, there's no sound. And the thing is that if you're actually, imagine you're actually there out in the storm in the middle of a wood, and there's a storm raging, and with one great ear-splitting crash, a tree, big tree, falls to the ground, and you hear it. It's not just that the tree sent you a sound, and you say, oh, that's a tree falling. You actually sense in your own body, because you feel that you are complicit in that very process. You have become part of the trees falling, and you feel the thump on the ground as a shudder in your own being. It's as though, but the tree has no ears. The tree hears nothing. But in that instant, you have become part of the tree, and you are sharing through your own experience that sense of the trees falling. So through that example, I was trying to get the idea that what we do is lend our ears, extend our oral attention to things around us, so they gain a voice that they wouldn't otherwise have. So the tree, in a sense, is hearing itself fall, but it's only hearing itself fall because we have become part of the tree in that very event. That's one thing. The other example I was thinking about, which I didn't develop here, is about myth and storytelling. That many anthropologists would argue, on the basis of what people have told them, that creatures other than human do indeed tell stories. But they would say that the life of the creature is its story, that in living its life, the creature tells its stories, and that's fine. But one thing that the creature doesn't do is to weave its story with the stories of other creatures into a story for the world. And I think only humans do that. And so what we're doing, it's a kind of meta story. It's not, here's this creature with its story, here's that creature with its story. To weave those two stories together into a meta story, we have to use metaphor. And one example comes from, I took a long time ago, it comes from Papua New Guinea, where women who make string bags say that when you're a really good string bag maker, your hands flow like running water. Just like that, really skilled. That's a metaphor. The hands flow like water. So they're comparing the water flowing, that's the water story, with the hands flowing, that's the woman's story. And they're saying, look, there's a metaphor, that there's something that the flow of the water and the flow of the movement of the hands have together. And it's that metaphoric construction that makes it possible to weave different stories together into a more encompassing story for the world. And I don't think it's possible to do that without language. Or I think you might say that language is an instrument of metaphor in that sense. And that's what allows us to weave together these stories. And because we can do that, that gives us also a peculiar responsibility that other creatures don't have. That's as far as I've got, but it's how I'm trying to think about it at the moment. I somehow feel that you can see rhetorically, it makes sense for anthropologists to argue, as they do, that we should get rid of all this anthropocentrism. We should recognize that other than humans have their stories, that they tell their stories. We should stop putting humans on a pedestal. Of course, we can agree with all that. But to argue that therefore there is absolutely nothing that distinguishes, that makes humans exceptional in the way about the way they comport themselves in the world, that seems to me to be absurd. And we need to call that absurdity out. and try and say that, yes, humans are exceptional, but we need to find a different way of expressing it than the way that we've inherited from the Enlightenment, which is all about reason. But there's a lot of work still to get this, to clarify this argument.
Okay.
Quick one. I like the idea that you remind us that human comes from the Latin humus. So, and I forgot how you put that, but that we have to be buried someday. But actually, I heard that in Europe and perhaps also other Western countries now, more and more people refuse to be buried and they prefer to be burned. Well, that's not an issue in Taiwan and other East Asian countries where most people, well, it's just the cultural habit here is to be burned. So I just wonder, well, I live in, I guess because I'm getting old, so I'm sorry. I don't know what will happen with, but it's just, I don't know what's best. I mean, I prefer the idea of getting back to the humus. It's much more environmental friendly, but it takes land. So perhaps getting burned is better, but it has a more important carbon footprint. I wonder if you have discussed this issue with your students, and what are you considering for yourself? Would you prefer to be, I mean, sorry, that's very impolite, but it's well, just sorry.
Okay, actually, it doesn't really matter what the proper original meaning of human was. Nobody quite knows. The important thing is that it's a very old word, and its origins are quite obscure. It was actually Giambattista Vico, in his New Science of 1790 something, Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher, who came up with this idea that human came from humus and that it referred back to this practice of burial from humando. Experts, from what so far as I understand, experts, linguists, etymologists are still fiercely debating this question, but I'm told that the weight of expert opinion is that Vico was wrong, that this etymology was fanciful, but then nobody knows actually. If the word human didn't come from humus, well, then nobody actually knows where it comes from, but it's been around for a long time. So the Romans, for example, to be a human being, you were a person, and there was a distinction between the human and the slave. A slave was classed along with domestic animals. The human was a citizen with rights. So it's an old word that's had many meanings. And what I didn't mention was that the idea that has most greatly influenced me came from a Catalan philosopher from the 13th century, Ramon Llull, who said, "Homo est animal homificare." Homo est animal homificans, which means, translated, means the human is a humanifying animal. And Llull's idea was that it's an animal that is continually creating itself in the crucible of its common life. Humans are what humans do. They humanify. And it's almost untranslatable. And Llull got to this idea because he was actually a Christian living in Morocco, but he interacted a lot with his Arab neighbors and learned Arabic. And it was from the Arabic that he got this, because Arabic has different grammar, but he got this idea of that you could treat human as a verb and say homificans, humaning. The human is a humaning animal. And that came from Llull, and that was in the 13th century, a long, long way before the Enlightenment. So I get a bit annoyed with colleagues, anthropological colleagues, who keep telling us that human is a concept from the Enlightenment, that it's associated with colonialism and all sorts of bad things. The idea of humanity as a condition might be an Enlightenment invention, but the idea of the human is very, very difficult. As for myself, I suppose that I will be reduced to ash and thrown into the sea or something. That's what's happened with my relatives. I have no wish to be buried myself. So, but it's, and of course, there are all sorts of other practices. I've worked well, my own interest has been with northern circumpolar peoples, where traditionally the thing to do was to put the body in a branch of a tree. So it was above the ground, actually, not buried at all. I put it up in a tree so it wouldn't be eaten up by animals wandering on the ground. Anyway, that's my answer.
Okay, I think we should stop here. And maybe let's say thank you to Professor Ingold again. We would like to take a group photo, so if you want to join us, please stay.